The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Well, Pat was right. Reince Priebus, Trump's chief of staff, the next to be fired in the midst of the constant chaos, endless scandals, and one of the really least functional White Houses we've seen in a very, very long time. It's not even really clear what Reince did wrong, but generally, things are chaotic in the White House. The chief of staff takes the hit, and Reince Priebus took the hit. It's not clear that Trump and Reince had the best relationship. I read over the weekend that Trump once had Reince Priebus come into the Oval Office to try to kill a fly that was flying around and bothering Trump. Not really a sign of respect to Reince Priebus. Trump, of course, announced the firing via Twitter. I mean, it's sort of, where else would he do it at this point? Tweeting over the weekend, "I am pleased to inform you that I have just named General Secretary John F. Kelly as White House Chief of Staff. He is a great American and a great leader." Both of those terms capitalized, great American and great leader. John has also done a spectacular job at Homeland Security. He has been a true star of my administration. At this point, what it means to be a true star of Trump's administration is you haven't yet had to resign. Trump hasn't yet fired you, and you've mostly gone under the radar by not doing anything particularly outrageous. That makes you a star in the Trump administration.
It's an interesting move, too. I mean, John Kelly as the chief of staff, he's not like he's a politician or anything. And, I'm sure he can keep command of all the different staff members in the White House, but can he really reach out to Congress and talk about health care and tax policy and infrastructure?
Hard to imagine. And a lot of this just plays directly into Anthony Scaramucci's hands, right? He's the new White House communications director who, according to Sean Spicer, was the reason that Press Secretary Sean Spicer quit recently. And Priebus said after the announcement that he had always been super clear with Trump. When you think it's time for a new chief of staff, I would support it. Of course he would. He would have no choice but to support it. So several issues here. One is the one that Pat is alluding to. Hiring, when you hire someone like another former general, you are putting more military closer to the Oval Office. Kelly is a retired four-star general. We already thought Trump's Oval Office was sort of military heavy, and that is growing, right? The proximity to Trump of military advice continues to grow. That's one issue. How exactly do Kelly's skills lead themselves to what a chief of staff, what a good chief of staff, sort of in the vein of Doug Stamper in House of Cards. I'm sort of kidding, hopefully not killing people. Hope I didn't spoil anything for you from season one. But in any case, or maybe not season one, but I'm getting off track here.
A little bit later.
Yeah. Back to my point. I don't know exactly what skills Kelly brings that are going to be useful as a chief of staff. But also this opens up, because he was Homeland Security Secretary, the move of John Kelly from Homeland Security Secretary to Chief of Staff opens up a slot for nomination and confirmation for Homeland Security Secretary, which in itself might become quite a show, given what's going on with the Trump White House right now.
And do you know one of the names being floated for that position?
No.
Jeff Sessions, because that would be an easy way to satisfy both parties and end all of this nonsense.
Wow. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll see if that eventually happens. The other issue I want to mention is things are great right now between Trump and Scaramucci, right? They're on the same page. Priebus out, stop the leaks, blah, blah, blah. When Trump and Scaramucci stop getting along, it could single-handedly implode the Oval Office. Those two have the types of personalities where if they no longer are on the same page, it will go nuclear, for lack of a better term. And I personally can't wait for that. Also, another tweet that we have for you here regarding Donald Trump's prior statements about chiefs of staff. Donald Trump tweeting back in January of 2012, 3 chief of staffs, which of course it's chiefs of staff, 3 chief of staffs in less than 3 years. Wouldn't it be fewer than 3 years? Of being president. Part of the reason why Barack Obama can't manage to pass his agenda, if ever that was representative of what's going on right now. Trump unable to do anything amid constant turnover and scandal among his staff and cabinet.
Well, now he's on his second chief of staff in only 7 months. So at that rate, that's going to be a much more turnover than Obama ever had.
The one other thing I want to mention here, there's another aspect to this. Priebus was a mainline establishment, what I would call GOP Inc. Republican. Priebus being gone means that the mainstream Republican Party is more and more separate from the Trump administration. The mainstream Republican Party could have a more and more difficult time having their views heard by the Trump administration. And it could also mean that Republicans will increasingly not be interested in working with Trump or defending Trump. Think about it. Priebus is out. Spicer was the former Republican RNC spokesperson, I believe. He's out. You bring in some military people and Steve Bannon from Breitbart and Anthony Scaramucci from who knows what financial services cesspool. Sessions is holding on for now, but Trump seems to want him out. The next step is an escalation with North Korea, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the program, but it is not looking good for the Donald Trump agenda. After some uncertainty, the Obamacare repeal in the U.S. Senate is dead again. Republicans totally unable to unite behind a plan to get rid of the Affordable Care Act after threatening to do it, promising to do it for most of Barack Obama's presidency. We saw Republican Susan Collins, Republican Lisa Murkowski, and of course, Republican Senator John McCain vote against the repeal, Trump saying that the three had let the American people down. The last iteration that they tried was what's being called a skinny repeal. The skinny repeal would have led not to the reduction in obesity rates, as the word skinny might suggest, but rather it would have led to 16 million people losing health insurance by 2026, as well as an increase in premiums of 20% above and beyond the current projections. Senator John McCain, recently diagnosed with brain cancer, has been getting a ton of attention around his vote against this. And Mike Pence was seen talking to McCain for about 20 minutes right before the vote. But then McCain went over to a group of Democrats who all seemed thrilled to see him walk over, and ultimately McCain voting against this repeal. Now, I get that McCain's vote was somewhat of a surprise, but I think people are going a little overboard, Pat, in calling McCain the hero here. I mean, Collins and Murkowski are just as responsible for this as McCain. All of the other Democrats onto which these three Republican votes were added to are just as responsible for this as is John McCain. And by the way, what about the people that created Obamacare, including the former president, Barack Obama? Yeah, John McCain has somewhat of a conscience, and that does distinguish him from a lot of the Republican Party right now, but it doesn't make him the savior here.
Well, sure, but I think we knew that all 48 Democrats would vote against any Obamacare repeal efforts. And as far as Republicans are concerned, I mean, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski were pretty certain no's as well. We just didn't know which moderate was going to join them, if any, if it was going to be McCain or Capito or Heller.
But that's
and you
my
needed
point.
Someone.
That's my point, which is while it was surprising and sort of unknown until the last moment, it's not any more heroic. And what I'm thinking about more and more is Joe Biden reportedly lobbied John McCain before this vote, which is interesting. And I believe it's time for John McCain to leave the Republican Party, not because he's some progressive panacea, but because he's just not radical enough to be in the Republican Party. There's lots of center-right in the Democratic Party right now. And John McCain once considered leaving the Republican Party. I don't think there's really much of a place for McCain in the Republican Party right now.
Well, it seems like a lot of Republicans voted for this knowing that it would never actually be signed into law because the next step would be to join it with the House bill in conference. But I think McCain was concerned because the House could just pass the skinny bill as well. And then that goes to the president's desk. And he didn't want that to happen. So in that regard, I think he did stand on principle here.
Well, that principle, to whatever extent it was heroic, as it's being portrayed by some, did lead to the situation we have now. And the next question is, what next, right? Obamacare seems sort of like it's not just this thing, but it's part of our healthcare system now. It's not some crazy appendage. It's been around for 7 years. It's by and large, furthering the same for-profit insurance system that we have, but it did some good things. Trump and the Republican establishment are really the losers here, and now they will do everything they can to make Obamacare fail. We might have news about that in the next day or two. Obamacare is not in a death spiral. It's having the exact same issues that all of health insurance is, which is rising premiums, people who still can't afford care. There's nothing particularly disastrous about Obamacare. It sucks like our entire healthcare system sucks, just in slightly mitigated ways by increasing the risk pool and increasing some subsidies. So what's next for Trump? Obamacare repeal is dead. The travel ban is in limbo at best. Tax reform is on the back burner for now, although some Republicans are saying that's what they want to get back into next. The wall with Mexico is laughable, and Trump's new NAFTA deal is really similar to the TPP proposal that Donald Trump was against. I genuinely don't know what's next here, which is why, and we're going to talk about North Korea more in the next segment, which is why I am worried that 6 months into his presidency, Trump is a pseudo lame duck. And what now could happen is an erratic or desperate move to get himself involved in a military escalation. The top candidate right now would be North Korea. Syria is a possibility. Iran is a possibility. And that's why I'm really scared about the next 6 months for Trump.
That is interesting, especially because it feels as if Democrats are trying to run out the clock and succeeding in doing so already a quarter of the way to the midterms. And you think about what issues he might be able to win on. Not many, because a lot of these bills you can't just hide in budget reconciliation. You need 60 votes for, say, tax reform.
Correct.
I think the move here is maybe to go for infrastructure, because you can get Democrats on board with that as well.
Maybe, and Trump does want to do it in a totally sort of crony capitalistic way with handouts to all his construction and real estate buddies. But if Democrats can get some compromise on some issues that they want, pet projects, whatever, then that could be a possibility. Trump is going to need to rebuild his influence and credibility now, particularly if Jeff Sessions goes. And one of Trump's last links to the mainline Republican Party is Sessions right now. So what happens if and when Sessions goes? And this is why I'm worried that this could push Trump into haphazard and very erratic action with maybe the top candidate, North Korea, if not Syria or Iran. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the program. I'm on Twitter @DPacman. Follow me there. Send me your thoughts there. We'll be back after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Stefan Winter. Stefan, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. You can sign up and join Stefan at davidpakman.com/membership. Big announcement. We are going to have a major membership discount special on August 12th. Okay, so we've got 2 weeks until that happens. If you want to be notified about this historic, I dare say, membership discount, just get on our mailing list, okay? Go to davidpakman.com, sign up for the newsletter, and on August 12th, you will be notified about how to sign up for this just gigantic membership special. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow to support our program. And if you ever shop on Amazon, go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop to support us with the items you buy. Let's now get to North Korea. North Korea appears to have fired another missile. I already mentioned that for many reasons, we should be worried that Donald Trump will be looking for an escalation with North Korea. Escalation would be great for Trump. Nothing going on legislatively. The recent subsequent additional failure of the Obamacare repeal. No achievements to speak of, constant scandals, a sort of circus of clueless aides and staffers and cabinet members and advisors. North Korea fired a projectile early in the weekend, landed in the Japanese exclusive economic zone. The Pentagon detected the launch. Japan's chief cabinet secretary said that the North Korean missile flew about 45 minutes before landing. The U.S. military and the South Korean military have been meeting to discuss possible options. China, which is North Korea's longtime and really, I think it's fair to say, only serious ally, has been pressuring North Korea to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile program. That hasn't worked too well. And Donald Trump now is also going after China. In the wake of this incident, Donald Trump took to Instagram. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, Twitter. That's where he always goes. And he tweeted, "I am very disappointed in China. Our foolish past leaders have allowed them to make hundreds of billions of dollars a year in trade, yet they do nothing for us with North Korea, just talk. We will no longer allow this to continue. China could easily solve this problem. For all the reasonable and fair criticisms of China, which there are many, does Donald Trump realize that if he really does sour our relationship with China, that tons and tons of products that Americans buy will get way more expensive in a way that could be crushing to the American economy? I'm not defending China, Pat, to be clear. Sure. Pat's making notes like, oh, David's defending China now. Does Trump have any idea how these basic issues of economics and trade work? I genuinely don't think he does. We have no reason to think he does.
No, he doesn't. And obviously, I mean, these issues are much more complex than he thinks they are.
Of course.
Solving, the North Korean crisis isn't as easy as having China go do it for you. Solving peace in the Middle East isn't as easy as sending Jared Kushner over there. I mean, these things are complex.
They are very complex. And there's no evidence whatsoever that Trump understands any of it. But let's put China aside for a second, right? Back to North Korea. Experts say that North Korea currently is known to have the ability to send missiles to all of South Korea, Japan, and Guam. The Pentagon has declassified an email which says that this was an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, that traveled about 1,000 kilometers. The South Korean president is seeking a UN Security Council meeting to consider stronger sanctions on North Korea. We'll talk about whether that makes sense. And an expert says that North Korean ICBMs might be currently able to reach some major U.S. cities on the West Coast. So these are significant risks that exist.
And I've even seen on the East Coast, now there's really questions as to if they would be accurate or if you could attach a nuclear warhead to those missiles. But it would be interesting to see if our representatives in Congress, if Trump himself changes his tone on this, knowing that it's more of an existential threat.
Correct. And that's the question, right? U.S. and South Korean defense officials are saying, well, what are our military response options after this? And this is a very difficult situation because sanctions appear to do very little other than to starve the population of North Korea, which we are presumably not trying to starve. You can do military action, but you have to sort of concede that there will probably be pretty significant civilian casualties. And that's where Trump needing to do something for his presidency and being increasingly isolated and miserable and erratic and watching TV in the Oval Office, that's where it could come into play. And we're going to be watching it very, very closely. Last week, I reported to you that Donald Trump on Twitter announced a ban on all transgender military service members. Donald Trump taking to Twitter and saying that, quote, after consultation with my generals and military experts, please be advised that the United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military. Our military must be focused on decisive and overwhelming victory and cannot be burdened with the tremendous medical costs and disruption that transgender in the military would entail. Thank you. Questions we had at the time. Did the Pentagon expect this? Another question, what is the exact policy and how do you enforce the policy with regard to existing trans service members? We aren't going to be able to find a lot of those things out for a little while because in addition to learning that the Department of Defense and Pentagon didn't expect this announcement to begin with, Donald Trump also didn't actually direct anyone at the Pentagon to do anything. So Trump has announced this on Twitter. Trump announces lots of major direction and policy on Twitter. But tweets aren't actual policy guidance. We've sort of established that, yes, Trump's tweets are declarations of Trump's position. They're declarations of intentions. But the people that work for Trump don't take orders via Twitter. So the Joint Chiefs have since said, when they were asked reasonable questions like, oh, how do you enforce this? They've said, oh, no modifications to the transgender policy are being made because Donald Trump has sent public tweets, but none of us have actually been directed to do anything. And we've since heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Pat, that until Trump sends what's called official directive to the Pentagon, nothing's going to happen.
If you look at that announcement there, you see that it's in 3 tweets, and the first 2 were about 10 minutes apart from each other.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people at the Pentagon were on pins and needles wondering what he was going to do. If it was going to be something major like war with North Korea, I mean,
Can you imagine?
Knew?
Can you imagine? You have officials who are just watching Twitter to figure out, like, oh, are we about to bomb someone, or are we about to put boots on the ground somewhere, or are we about to honorably or dishonorably start discharging thousands of people based on their status as transgender individuals? It's whacked.
Because he said he was consulting with his generals. I mean, that sounds like a very big announcement, which this was, but it's just much different than you'd expect.
White House was asked about this. They said, well, Donald Trump has every intention of carrying this out. So still no answers to really serious questions like, how do you determine which people already in the military are transgender, right? What do you do if they're discharged? Do you do it honorably or dishonorably? Dishonorably, of course, would strip them of access to a lot of really important veterans benefits. That would be a disaster. Even if you discharge existing transgender military service members honorably after figuring out who they are, it can still be a problem. Back under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you could be honorably discharged for being discovered to be homosexual, and it would show, quote, homosexual admission or homosexual conduct on your honorable discharge, which could present some pretty serious issues when you're trying to get another job. You could be hypothetically honorably discharged for, quote, transgender admission, and that would still be potentially really bad for you if you're trying to get a job later on.
Oh, this would be horrible, especially if he does decide to dishonorably discharge them, because then it's hard to get employment.
Right.
And when you're talking about a group of people who is already stigmatized and has relatively high suicide rates, I mean, this could get much worse.
It's an absolute disaster. It's an absolute disaster. So if there's a silver lining, it's that this has not actually been policy that Trump has formally directed to the Pentagon yet. But presumably at some point that will change, assuming we believe Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And why would anyone ever doubt something that Sarah Huckabee Sanders says? Major news from Bernie Sanders yesterday. He went on CNN State of the Union in the wake of yet another embarrassing failure by Republicans to repeal Obamacare. Bernie Sanders is saying he will be introducing a single-payer health care bill in the Senate. Here he is explaining it to Jake Tapper.
We're going to introduce a single-payer health care plan literally as soon as we're through with the Republican health care debate. It seems like we're through, and the Obamacare repeal effort has collapsed. Are you going to introduce single-payer?
Absolutely. Of course we are. We're just, we're tweaking the final points of the bill, and we're figuring out how we can mount a national campaign to bring people together. Right. Here's where we are, Jake, and it's important for Americans to understand this.
Please.
We are the only major country on earth, the only one, not to guarantee health care to all people. The result is 28 million people who are uninsured, millions of people who are paying deductibles and co-payments that are far too high. And if the Republicans had gotten their way, there would have been another 30 or 32 million people thrown off of health insurance.
It's great to introduce a bill, particularly one that I agree with. I do have to break it to Bernie and to everybody else that introducing a bill is very different than the Democratic Party taking on single-payer health care or Medicare for all as part of their platform. Case in point, House Democrats have been introducing some version of this past January's H.R. 676 Medicare for all bill for a long time, and it is barely a blip on any radar. You might know about it from independent news sources. I've been talking about it. But it's a non-starter because no significant portion of the Democratic Party is united behind it. Now, this will be some kind of a Medicare for all proposal. Some people don't get why that's an attractive path versus a new single-payer system. The general idea is we have Medicare already. So you've got the infrastructure in place. All you do is change the age requirement, right? You say instead of having to be 65, you can be 0 and be part of the Medicare system, and then you separately pass legislation for its funding. As a general thing, when you adapt an existing system, it's simpler, faster, and less expensive than creating a brand new system. You could probably get this done. The legislation could be done in weeks, never mind months. A new system would take a very, very long time. I support this, but it is mostly a non-starter, although I say cheers to Bernie Sanders, and I hope it gets more attention. It's certainly not going to pass with Republicans controlling the House, Senate, and the White House, but the most powerful thing that Democrats could do is make this a part of the platform. Make it a part of the official platform and campaign on this.
It's obviously not going to pass, but what I think the good that would come out of this would be you get some of those Democrats on record, because a lot of them are running away from this issue. They don't want to speak on if they support Medicare for all or not. And now it'll be up to a vote. People are going to know where they stand on it.
That's the biggest advantage of this, right? Which is we will be potentially able to get, and remember, just introducing a bill doesn't mean that you will ultimately have a vote on it. We've got a lot of steps here, but you could potentially get Senate Democrats on the record who don't support this. It's not going to pass, right? We know it's not going to pass under the current House and Senate control by Republicans and Donald Trump in the White House. So therefore, this is a good opportunity for Democrats who want this to vote yes in order to be able to tout their I supported Medicare for all credentials to their constituents. If you still vote no on a totally safe vote in the sense that it will never actually pass, then you really must not want this. And many corporate Democrats probably don't want this because the insurance industry, we talk about here's issues where Republicans and Democrats are very similar, and here's issues where Republicans and Democrats are very different. The funding from health insurance companies is pretty ubiquitous and widespread, and this could be really useful in figuring out who's actually on the side of this among the Democrats.
I do have to play devil's advocate here, though, because it does sound a little bit to me like Republicans voting to repeal Obamacare 61 times and spending millions of dollars on it, knowing that Obama himself would veto the bill.
Yeah.
Is this a little bit of the same thing?
It's a fair criticism in that it's not going to pass. So the value of introducing the bill is pretty limited, other than for Bernie Sanders as saying, I officially support this. That's exactly why I think the value is make it part of the Democratic platform. Medicare for all. It's a strong position, and negotiate from that as opposed to, as I've said many times, Obama's public option would be kind of nice. Oh, no? Okay, then we'll get rid of it. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean Obamacare didn't do some good things. It certainly doesn't change the reality that Obamacare reinforced the employer-connected for-profit insurance system that we have. But putting that aside, make this your platform, Democrats. Already, many people discussing this on our Reddit discussion forum, where nearly 4,000 of our viewers and listeners are regularly discussing politics. Go to davidpakman.com/Reddit. Join the discussion.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program Michael Wood Jr., who's a police management expert, activist, president of Veterans Stand, as well as former Baltimore police commander. Michael, it's great to have you back on the program, and the timing really couldn't be better, although I don't know if better is the right word to use here. You reacted to this speech that Donald Trump gave in front of a law enforcement crowd, where he sort of jokingly said, you know, it's really not a bad idea to kind of rough up suspects that you have in custody if they've been accused or are suspected of having committed a serious enough crime, which to me, it was disturbing on so many levels, not the least of which that being arrested for something is not the same as having been convicted of something, regardless of how serious it is. So take it from the top. I mean, what was your reaction to the comments from President Trump?
Well, thanks for having me again. And I mean, the basic idea that's really bothering me when it comes to what Trump is saying is that that's the seed that we kind of have in our culture, that we aren't looking at the command structure. We aren't looking at the actual power that's incentivizing all this and setting these balls in motion. What we end up doing is we blame the officer that actually bangs the head on the door. But this whole thing is a part of a culture that comes down. And when you are the president, then you are talking down to police officers or whoever's out on the street to execute your will, to go and do something that is against the basic premise of professional law enforcement. Even as bad as American law enforcement is, there is not a best practices book or a police expert out there that's going to say you treat convicted suspects this way, let alone citizens who are proven innocent, who are innocent until proven guilty. So there is this systemic attitude where policing ends up encapsulating like what America really is. And I'm anti-Trump just as much as I'm anti-sneezing, but I don't blame the sneeze for my sneeze. Like he is a product of us. And if we can't see that this really demonstrates what America is in its soul, and we need to fight that, then I don't really know what people are looking at.
There's a similar idea that we sometimes hear when it comes to the sentencing of individuals convicted of child sex abuse and some other crimes sometimes. This idea that, hey, their punishment will be made worse because they might get sexually assaulted in our prisons or in our jails. And when I hear that, I say, that's not something that we should be applauding because it's going to make their time worse. That's sort of an inability of our prison system to keep individuals safe. Like the fact that you might be sexually assaulted in prison, depending on the crime that you're convicted of, that's something that we should be concerned about, not cheering as part of some additional justice. Is there a similarity between these two ideas?
We should be incredibly concerned. And I'm really happy you brought that up and have made that connection that you see in our prison system. And again, that is America, right? We say to ourselves, let's punish this person. Let's put them into a system where they will have injustice, inhumanity. They will be assaulted and have all this punishment go down upon them, despite the fact that punishment isn't going to do anything to make the situation better. And then we are trying to like change the prison system and say criminal justice needs to be better, but at the same time applauding when someone we don't like goes into an inhumane system. We do the same thing with police. Like as much as I want to see accountability in policing, there is no justice in sending a police officer to an inhumane and unjust system. So we have to really look in ourselves to figure out, like, what do we really want policing to be? Are we the country that's going to stand up and say we want to be a punitive thing? We don't care about science, despite the fact that every meta-analysis of scientific literature will show you that punishment does not equal a deterrent, that we are still so hell-bent on being a violent society that wants to even thinks that these things would work. Like, we're going down a pathway that is incredibly concerning to me. And obviously it is to you.
You used the word systemic a little bit earlier in the interview. And I think if we sort of imagine a spectrum, you might have those completely on one side who believe that the issues with police violence and police brutality are 100% systemic and that there's very little blame to place on the individual officers. On the other side of that spectrum, you might imagine those who believe this is merely a few bad apples. Only the individual police officers are to blame here, and there is nothing systemic going on. The truth is probably sort of somewhere in the middle of that, but I want to ask you, where do you think it is? In other words, how much of this problem is the individuals? How much of the problem is systemic?
I mean, like, of course, I'm throwing out a ballpark number, but I'm going to go with probably 95% to 99% is completely systemic. The way I can kind of encapsulate this on an individual, intimate level here is that I grew up trying to be race blind. I mean, I grew up in the age of information, in mixed neighborhoods, and I had this idea to myself that as a police officer, what I was going to do is be impartial. I was going to follow the letter of the law. I was going to follow departmental policies to a T. And it took me a while, but I realized eventually at the end that all of my actions of what I was empirically doing on the street was racist. It was prejudice against the society. It was inhumane. It was unjust. And all of those things that I was doing, I was really looking at the system and saying, if we do this perfectly, if we do this system perfectly, then we will have justice.
So explain that a little bit. Like, so for example, I mean, having interviewed you before, would one example of what you're talking about be, despite the reality that you went in wanting to be race blind and not discriminating, et cetera, for example, by virtue of the neighborhoods you were policing, the impact of your policing was going to be effectively racist? Is that an example of what you mean?
Yeah, that's a good example. Or whether I put someone into bond, or whether I was looking at, so I thought I was a narcotics detective hunting down narcotics, but I wasn't. There was an entire half of that city, which we know empirically without a doubt, and anyone can argue it, and I know it from practical experience, that white communities have just as much drugs, if not more. One reason why cocaine sentencing is much higher is not because of a racist thing intentionally. It's because cocaine is a white drug. And so white drugs end up having more resources. So a mid-level dealer ends up being much higher on the scale of being resourced. Same damn word I used a second ago. But so those things that when we end up doing, we think this is normal, but when we end up going after the drug, where do they put me? They put me in East and West Baltimore to go after drug dealers. So I end up going after only the community because the drug dealing and drug possession is actually equal, if not more, in a rich and white community. Think about it. Drugs are expensive. Like they're not going to, I mean, people with money have more drugs than people without money. That's just it's even rational. But where was I sent to go get the drugs? In redlined, poor neighborhoods to put into an inhumane system that has a bail system that they can't do. So it's not necessarily the officer's fault that when they're doing that, and even if they do it well, they send people into a system. So even if you had a police department that was operating perfectly, they would still be sending people and handing them off to a state's attorney, who the state's attorneys are blatantly corrupt around the country. They are incentivized in that same system. So they have the same problems. They're incentivized to win, not for justice. So like we talk about federal prosecutors, like, oh, you better be aware of those federal prosecutors. They have a 97% conviction rate. Well, they don't have a 97% conviction rate. They have a 97% victory rate, which means the cases are plead down or whatever they do, they use and manipulate power so that they can rise to the ranks. So they don't get incentivized to do the right thing. They get incentivized for the most convictions to rise up through the ranks. And then prisons are incentivized to be as efficient as possible. So give people as really little resources as possible while we're doing this punishment system. So it is this whole big institution that police officers are a pawn of. It's the people above the street cops that all set this thing into motion and don't take any of the responsibility for it. One reason why you see cops getting away with committing murders right on camera is when these things indict the system. When they indict the system, the whole thing will rally around them to protect them and get them off, like Freddie Gray. So when the officers killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore, no supervisors took accountability for this. So understanding this killing, what happened is by the court case anyway, he goes into a van where they're supposed to be transporting him to a prison cell. They already put him in there for really sketchy reasons to begin with, but then they bring him out of the van dead. So the whole time, this is a van that doesn't have seatbelts, doesn't have proper supervision, doesn't have cameras in the back, doesn't have any accountability. And Freddie Gray was the fourth person to be killed or paralyzed in the back of those vans just in recent history. But no command members, Kevin Davis doesn't pay a price, the mayor doesn't pay a price. Nobody has anything happen to them other than the individual officer at the bottom who was really just a pawn all along.
We've been speaking with Michael Wood Jr. He is a former Baltimore police commander. You can follow him on Twitter at Michael A. Wood Jr. and also check out civilianledpolicing.org. Michael, always great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Thanks for throwing in those pictures there. We definitely need people to go to Veteran Stand and civilian-led policing. That is the way you guys can take something in your own hands and do something in your community.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I have yet another one of these horrifying stories about the brutal Putin regime that we're still sort of trying to figure out. I told you a while back that Mikhail Lesin was found dead in his Washington, D.C. hotel room back in November of 2015, okay? Lesin was Vladimir Putin's former media czar, and the date of his death is November 5, 2015. And that's relevant because on November 6, 2015, he was scheduled to meet with the U.S. Justice Department, reportedly to talk about the inner workings of Russian propaganda channel RT, which Lesin himself helped create. But of course, he never made it to the interview because he was found dead. He was found dead with blunt force injuries to the head, neck, and torso. And after a year of so-called investigation, a federal prosecutor announced that Lezin died alone in his room due to drunkenly falling multiple times after drinking for days. The death was ruled an accident and the case was closed as far as prosecutors were concerned. However, we now have two FBI agents speaking out saying that is not what happened. They say that Lezin was actually murdered, bludgeoned to death, in fact. We have a quote from one of these FBI agents with knowledge of the incident. Lezin was beaten to death. I would implore you to say as much. There seems to be an effort here to cover up that fact for reasons I can't get into. What I can tell you is that there isn't a single person inside the Bureau who believes this guy got drunk, fell down, and died. Everyone thinks he was whacked and that Putin or the Kremlin were behind it. One of these officials went as far as to say a baseball bat was the particular tool that was used in the bludgeoning of Mikhail Lezin. At the time, Lezin was working for state-owned Gazprom Media, or about a year before this incident. He was working for Gazprom Media. He abruptly resigned in 2014. He reportedly had a falling out with Vladimir Putin's close confidants and went into hiding abroad. And the hypothesis is that he sort of became a liability for Vladimir Putin when a letter was written by U.S. Senator Roger Wickett to the Justice Department asking for them to investigate what was going on with Lezin. And this is yet another one of these suspicious Russian deaths. BuzzFeed did a 2-year investigation into 14 Russian deaths that were suspicious on British soil, most of which were ignored by the UK government. And as usual, Pat, with lots of these, including Lezin's death, we get reports that don't really make sense about the cause of death. We go to the medical examiner that was involved. They say, you know, we're barred by law from giving you the autopsy details. And he fell multiple times from being too drunk is weird. Like, is there an amount of alcohol that would cause you... So you could have a lot of alcohol and fall once and pass out, and maybe you would have like one injury from that. But to believe that you're drinking so much but still staying conscious and falling multiple times in your own hotel room until you die, it's weird.
It's because they have to work backwards with the explanation. So if he was actually bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat, you'd imagine that he was attacked from multiple angles, probably hit multiple times. So you can't just blame that on one fall. It has to be multiple falls. And it's the same thing as someone being stabbed in the back 11 times before falling out of a building. I mean, it's a ridiculous explanation.
So then the question becomes, presumably, someone or some combination of people want to cover this up. If indeed this was a Kremlin-sanctioned, ordered, Kremlin-involved hit, then there are people in the U.S. complicit in the cover-up. Why would they do that? And then it becomes speculation. Are there people in the Department of Justice allied with Vladimir Putin and they don't want to upset Putin? Are there people in the Department of Justice that are sort of just aware of how the situation would become hysterical if you start seeing headlines saying, hey, here's what really happened, and maybe they want to avoid escalation with Russia, a sort of realpolitik perspective? I don't know. But there is a very long list, a growing list of these suspicious deaths. Here's something you probably did not expect to hear, arguably ever. A sitting congressman wants the president of the United States investigated for threatening an American state, specifically Donald Trump's threat to the state of Alaska. We're now learning more about the nature of the threats that were issued by the Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke, to Alaska Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan last week. This was all related to the Obamacare repeal vote. Lisa Murkowski ultimately voted against Obamacare repeal. And we've heard from Dan Sullivan, the other senator, Republican senator from Alaska, about the nature of the threats that were received. And Dan Sullivan said, I'm not going to go into the details, but I fear that the strong economic growth, pro-energy, pro-mining, pro-jobs, and personnel from Alaska who are part of those policies are going to stop. I tried to push back on behalf of all Alaskans. We're facing some difficult times, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for the policies that Secretary Zinke and the president have been talking about with regard to our economy, but the message was pretty clear. The idea being that federal aid was being threatened. Raul Grijalva, who's the senior Democrat on the House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources, says he is asking the Government Accountability Office to investigate the allegations against the Interior Secretary. Threatening to punish your rivals as political blackmail is something that we would see from, it's going to sound kind of weird, from the Kremlin in Russia. Secretary Zinke's willingness to deliver these threats says a lot about the sort of ethical and moral standards that we're seeing from this administration. And Rachel Maddow pointed this out late last week. People went to jail for Bridgegate, right? That was where Republican New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and his allies really were involved in shutting down lanes on the George Washington Bridge. And that actually that was for political retribution in 2013. And it led to the death of a woman who needed an ambulance. 2 people went to prison for that. This is threatening an entire state's federal aid over a Senate vote.
It does sound to me like Trump and Zinke's threats completely backfired here, not only because you might have investigations or even indictments that come out of this, but also because the Obamacare repeal vote failed miserably. And Murkowski was put into a position where she had to vote no on those because otherwise it would look as if she was bullied into just accepting whatever Trump was saying, right? So she had to stand up for herself to not look weak.
If the news of this threat leaked, despite her voting no, it's very likely it would have leaked if she had voted yes. And then she would have had to explain, wait a second, you were a no for a while, you get this threat, and then now you vote yes.
And then you back down.
That's a whole new set of problems. And I want to be really clear. The follow through as to whether they actually do anything to Alaska's federal aid, it doesn't matter. It's like when Trump Jr. met with the Russian lawyer in Trump Tower. Whether or not he got the dirt on Hillary Clinton is not relevant. What matters is, did he intend to collude and receive things of value from a foreign hostile power? The threat here to hurt Alaska is the scandal. And in the midst of all the other scandals, this is barely registered. Like, we did a story last week, Pat, and it got about 62,000 views on YouTube. There's so much else going on that the president threatening one of the 50 states of the United States of America is not even making the news that it warrants.
I mean, there's just so much news and we couldn't possibly cover all of it, especially because, of course there's scandals, but you want to focus on the issues that really impact Americans day to day.
And
some things just have to get filtered out.
Alaska is currently seeking federal permission to expand oil drilling in the National Petroleum Reserve. And there are fears that the White House might block that as retribution. Is that a possible silver lining? Like, maybe despite a completely ridiculous and capricious threat against the state of Alaska, they might prevent Alaska from doing more drilling that would be bad for the environment. Have I found something of a silver lining here?
I don't know. And let's remember that Trump won Alaska, too. It's not like Chris Christie trying to get retribution on the counties that he lost in New Jersey.
It's very weird. It's very, very weird. And I hope that there is an investigation. I support Congressman Grijalva's call for one. We have a voicemail number 2192-DAVID-P. Here is yet again Troy York calling in. He has problems with Bernie Sanders. This time he's not presenting with a different name, but he's using what appears to be a fake accent or sort of voice. Yet another one of the multiple personalities of Troy York. Take a listen.
Bachman, I want to say that Bernie Sanders and the Bernie Bros are the biggest, most dangerous threat to democracy this world and this country faces. And Keith Olbermann on GQ.com is a paid anti-Trump hack, and I hope you are not one too. Thank you.
I hope not too also. Thank you. What are we up to, like 4 or 5? There's Cecil Brewster is one of Troy York's personalities. He has a Latino name that sometimes he calls in with. I forget what that is. So I think we're up to at least 4 personalities for Troy York.
I think Troy York does it all in good fun, though. I mean, he's definitely trolling here, but he may actually be a legitimate fan of the show and agree with 90% of what we say.
He does seem to listen to every single episode, so we've got that going for us. On the bonus show today, we will talk to you about the latest in Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's brutal drug war, which now has seen the 3rd Filipino mayor killed in this bizarre vigilante justice that is going on. We have reviews in for Tesla's Model 3, which now has started to be delivered to Tesla owners. And I will tell you about the latest with the Ohio State Fair reopening. We will learn, did Pat grow up going to various state fairs? Did I grow up going to state fairs? You probably know the answer, at least to that second part of the question. DavidPakman.com/membership is how you get access to the bonus show. Remember that on August 12th, we have a big membership promo going on. If you want to be notified about it, just get on our mailing list at davidpakman.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you will be notified. And that's going to be a huge thing. Folks, people are telling me it is going to be absolutely and utterly major. And if you don't want to wait and you just want to get access to the bonus show today, you go to davidpakman.com/membership and sign up. If you want a discount, you can use the coupon code IVoted17. And if you're thinking, David, I just want to give you money, I just want to send you $1 or $2 per month, it's as simple as going to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, patreon.com/David Pakman Show. You can make a pledge of as little as $1 or $2 per month, and over 1,800 of you have already done that. Let's make it happen, and I will speak to you on the bonus show in mere minutes.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.